We've got folks coming in. Anybody in the lobby, or everyone's?
Anyone.
Great. Okay. I'm David Murphy from the firm Milone and McBroom. We're the consultant that's been retained to update the hazard mitigation plan. We worked on the first hazard mitigation plan back in 2006, and my son was born that year, and now he's 11. I can't believe I'm back. It's great. It's a good feeling. Holly Backus from the town is my main point of contact. Say hello. And I'll take you through a quick agenda for what we're going to cover tonight. We'll talk about hazard mitigation planning, why we do it, what it means, and really what it's not. So we want to make sure we cover what it's all about and what we don't do in hazard mitigation plans. We'll talk about the benefits of having one of these plans. We'll talk about the plan development process. We'll just review quickly the natural hazards that we reviewed 11 years ago, which are the same that we're reviewing this time around. We'll talk about the different options for hazard mitigation, and then we'll just wrap up with what our next steps are, and I'll tell you about a survey that's open right now. You can take the survey on the internet if you'd like after this meeting. Okay. There's us. I don't remember which storm that is. I think it's Jose from this year. All right.
Are these slides going to be available to the public?
Is that okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, they typically are.
Yep.
Thank you.
They're on the town website.
Yeah, this is I should have said, this is the second public information meeting. We had one in October. The presentation is largely the same. We've added a few slides just to be consistent with things happening over the past couple weeks, couple months. But the presentation is up there, and this one can be up there as well. So hazard mitigation planning got underway shortly after the Disaster Mitigation Act of the year 2000. So this is before Hurricane Katrina, before 9/11. It surprises a lot of people to know that hazard mitigation planning started sort of before those milestone events in our life. And the goals of the act are to become more prepared and to implement measures that reduce losses. So we talk about loss of property, we talk about loss of life. Those are very important. Of course, we don't want to see people perish in natural hazard events. But really, one of the big losses that FEMA wants to see reduced is the financial loss. As you may have heard, FEMA has to pick up the pieces after natural disasters and give us money, and that costs all of us in the end. So reducing those financial losses is really one of the big things that hazard mitigation is about. Here in Massachusetts, most towns had their plans initially developed in about 2005, which is about when Nantucket's first plan was developed. Local plans are typically updated every 5 years. It's required to be updated every 5 years to be eligible for certain FEMA grants, but a plan can lapse, and that is what happened in Nantucket. It was adopted in the year 2007. There's no such thing as the year, whatever year that is, we're not there yet. So the plan was adopted in 2007, expired in 2012. We're here to update it today. And the Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation Plan is being updated right now at the same time. So it's kind of good to be going through that at the same time as the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. So what are natural hazards? These are extreme natural events that pose a risk to people, infrastructure, and resources. And what do they also do? Not just pose a risk, but they have a financial cost to them. So we're not talking about terrorism, sabotage, disaster response, and recovery, although we kind of talk about disaster response a little bit because mitigation and response kind of touch one another. And we're not talking about human-caused emergencies such as some kinds of fires, hazardous spills, etc. Those are best left to other kinds of plans. So mitigation is what we can do ahead of time to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to people, property, and resources from natural hazards and their effects. And as you probably can tell, the photo on the left is from 10 years ago. But mitigation, and I've used it, I've done this 100 times, folks. I've used this in a lot of other towns because it's a good example of an elevated home. So elevating a home reduces its flood losses, and removing homes from areas that are flood prone also can reduce losses. Those are two examples that you have right now that you see every day. So
Do you want us to wait with questions?
I think so, yeah. When we have only 2 or 3 people, we sort of let people interject. But if you could hold, it won't be a long presentation. So why should we plan? Everywhere else that I do this presentation, I have a picture of my family cottage in Wellfleet that I had to demolish 4 years ago, and I make it a very personal story. I figured that wouldn't play well here because you have real examples. So I can let my personal story go and show you some real examples that you have. So loss of neighborhood, eroded social fabric, which is a problem in Cape Cod where we demolished a home. Lost tax base, decreased economic activity. So there are financial implications to that, and FEMA wants to see those losses reduced as well. So the components of the planning process, we're reducing loss of life. Again, we don't experience that too much in this part of the country, but other parts of the United States do experience loss of life after disasters or during disasters. Reducing the damage to property and infrastructure, reduce those costs to all of us to keep bailing out wherever there's a disaster in this country. But also the town costs, municipal services, emergency response, you can reduce those costs if you've done some mitigation planning and some mitigation projects. Other really important components to hazard mitigation planning are education, connecting to other kinds of community planning efforts, and enhancing and preserving natural resources is always a goal for hazard mitigation planning as well. Those are photos from the last time around 10 years ago. The top one's kind of mitigation. You know, you're reducing losses if you're handling your watercraft before a storm. And then the bottom picture was a berm that someone had built. Again, this is 10 years ago to kind of reduce stormwater flowing onto their property. So the benefits of having a plan, it can provide a risk assessment to support various mitigation strategies. It can provide an action plan that FEMA can look at when it's dispersing funds for mitigation projects. It enhances coordination with the local, regional, state, and federal entities that are related to hazard mitigation. So at the local level, that's planning, that's emergency response, that's building, that's engineering. The state level, it's MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, and DCR, Department of Conservation and Resources. And then federal, of course, is FEMA. It provides information to FEMA to guide emergency response and post-event assistance. So here's some of the really good benefits. If you have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan in place, you are eligible to apply for and receive certain mitigation grants. So I'm not talking about after a disaster, let's say a tornado comes through where we are right now. FEMA's going to help out picking up the pieces from the tornado. But for mitigation projects, you need to have a plan in place for pre-disaster mitigation projects. And the three different funding vehicles are those three acronyms: PDM, pre-disaster mitigation, HMGP, and then FMA. Now, the HMGP is the one that everybody loves. That's the one that's well-funded after declared disasters. So after Irene and Sandy and the tornadoes of 2011, it hit Springfield, and Winter Storm Alfred in 2011, there was a lot of money in HMGP. Not as much money in HMGP right now. PDM comes around every year if Congress reauthorizes it. And FMA, that last one, that's really for flood-prone structures that are already experiencing a lot of flood losses. So the grant programs are different from one another. Grant funding is typically 75%, 25% is on the town. It can be met with cash or with in-kind services. Lots of times projects, we like to list them in the plan so it's easier to kind of apply for the funding. So the development process, developing the plan, is pretty much standard wherever we work. We identify the hazards that could occur. We look at what's vulnerable and what's at risk. So is it people, is it infrastructure, is it structures? How bad would a disaster be? What losses could be expected? We need to have loss estimates in the plan. We look at we assess capabilities, so what measures are already in place to reduce losses? Where is there room for improvement? There's a component which is outreach, which is what we're doing tonight. There's also the survey, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. We develop recommendations, objectives, goals, that sort of thing. And then the paperwork, we develop a document, submit it to MEMA, that's the state. They look at it, submit it to FEMA, and then it's approved and locally adopted by the Board of Selectmen, I believe. We talk about critical facilities in the hazard mitigation plan. People often wonder why we do this. Well, I've been a part of several grant applications where we got a lot of extra points because critical facilities were somehow protected. So shelters, the EOC, which is what we're in right now, emergency operations, municipal facilities, fire, police, public works, hospitals or medical. Sometimes assisted living and nursing homes can be considered critical facilities if people can't be evacuated easily. Schools, when they're used as shelters. And then here, of course, there's special facilities that other places don't have. an airport, ferry terminals, Coast Guard. We do look at historic and cultural resources, and there are many, because they can oftentimes be very much at risk because they're located at the edge of water or because they're older structures. And that's something that's important to FEMA as well, is reducing losses to historic resources. So the hazards that we're going to be talking about in the plan are the same as those that we addressed 10 years ago. I'll go through them. We're going to talk about kind of non-coastal flooding. I hate to use the word inland. It doesn't really work here, but FEMA recognizes the word inland. So here are some areas that we're talking about. And a lot of times it's related to drainage that's impeded, something that we can call nuisance flooding. So it's not a river overflowing here on Nantucket. We're also going to be addressing coastal flooding, which you're all familiar with, storm surges that can occur during nor'easters or tropical systems, and sea level rise, which we are addressing in hazard mitigation plans, because with or without the component that we're contributing to, sea level does rise on its own, so it is a natural hazard. And what does sea level rise cause? Accelerated erosion, inundation, increased incidence of flooding.
Could you back that up so we can see the list of streets on the previous?
Sure, and it's not a be-all, end-all. We can add to or subtract from that list. What I did is I went back into the previous plan and pulled out some of the streets that had been brought up at the time. Oh, and I should have mentioned, Holly put the previous plan online, so you can go to the town's website and look at the document.
We also have a copy right over there if you'd like it. See, while you're here.
Coastal flooding, of course, we'll be looking at areas that you're familiar with, downtown, Brant Point, and then western part of the island, eastern part of the island. Some areas that are maybe not inundated themselves, but at risk of isolation. We also look at that in hazard mitigation plans. We addressing hurricanes and tropical storms, which of course cause flooding, but also strong winds. I mean, for a long time, all we talked about was power lines down over the last few years. Back where I live in Connecticut, hurricanes and tropical storms can contribute to that. Some old pictures we found. My helper on this project likes to spend his time on the internet finding old pictures. I don't like to spend my time on the internet. Hurricane Carol. So we'll be talking about coastal erosion. If you remember the picture I had a few slides ago that I've used for the last 10 years, this is its counterpart today. And we talked about erosion in the previous hazard mitigation plan. And frankly, at the time, a lot of coastal towns weren't addressing erosion. They were kind of just talking about flooding. They're related, but they're a little bit different. And so, Nantucket already has a dynamic coastal environment. It's been eroding. We're probably accelerating that and maybe seeing some seasonal cycles or not. We can talk for a whole day. I love to talk about the little temporary sea level rise in 2010, 2011. That was measured off of Cape Cod in Maine and southeastern Massachusetts. But needless to say, erosion is accelerated by increasing coastal storms, increasing frequency or intensity or sea level rise. Area-specific problems. This is a map that we put in the plan 10 years ago. I'm sure we'll be looking for ways to improve this map. At the time, we kind of made it very cartoonish. We just circled areas that were experiencing erosion. Now we probably can be more specific and broaden this a little bit. Also, in the last 10 years, the state has done a lot of work documenting erosion rates, so we can bring that into the plan. Other natural hazards that we'll be covering: thunderstorms, tornadoes, the things that happen along with those storms. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. Winter storms, we forget a lot of our flooding is during winter storms. And some of the winter storms that happened in 2011 collapsed a lot of roofs throughout the state. Not here, I know, but that pumped a lot of money into the mitigation funding sources. Earthquakes, we don't really experience damage from earthquakes, but we feel them once in a while. Wildfires, this is a great one because Nantucket has some experience with large fires. So some of the hazard mitigation options that we look at in these plans, they really fall into 6 categories. The categories are right up there on the screen, and I'm going to just talk about what they are and are not. So, for example, prevention, we're not preventing the hazard from occurring. We can't prevent a hurricane. Prevention is preventing the losses. Remember, we're talking about losses in hazard mitigation plans. So we can prevent the losses through regulations where we allow things to be built. Structural projects, those are always the most fun. The word structural project implies removing earth. That's what everyone likes to do, and that's exactly what that is. Bridges, culverts, that sort of thing, walls. Natural resources on the right-hand side is kind of the opposite of structural projects. It's where we can pull back and let nature kind of have its way. Property protection is really about protecting the property, so elevating the home or maybe storm shutters. Public education is kind of what we're doing now, but making sure that there's always a public education component in play. We don't just do this once every 5 or 10 years, right? We need to do it kind of continuously. And then emergency services, that's kind of a strange category. So it's not, again, we're not here to dictate incident command. Police and fire know how to do that. It's really how we dovetail with what they do to make sure that they can respond, that they're not isolated during a flood. They can get to some other place. So if you take those 6 categories and apply them just to flooding alone, the big one, right, flooding, these are all the different kinds of mitigation actions you can recommend in a plan. So under prevention, it's different zoning, it's different codes of ordinance, it's regulations, it's what you can do in your comp plan, what you can say about how to reduce losses. For structural projects applied to flooding, some of the things I mentioned already, bridges and culverts. In inland places, it could be levees. Detention and drainage could work here. Property protection is typically the floodproofing, the elevating. Public education could be newsletters, meetings, what the town has on its website. In training for municipal staff falls under that. Natural resources, there's a picture of a buyout. I am always looking for good pictures of buyouts on the upper right, but they're not interesting because you put the picture in the PowerPoint and there's nothing in the vacant land. So there's a yellow box to show where there used to be a house. That's not here, of course, that's somewhere else. And then emergency services, making sure that we haven't reduced our response time, making sure that there are shelters in place and evacuation plans. So that's the 6 categories applied to flooding. If you apply them to other hazards, there's sort of a whole litany of options. So strengthening or reinforcing shelters or critical facilities, going code plus with a roof. If you're building a new building and it's public building, don't just go to the building code, build a roof stronger than that. Having backup facilities, putting utilities underground. Not everybody likes that. There's problems. There's no perfect world for utilities above or below ground. But hardening utilities, microgrids count as hazard mitigation so that if power is lost over here, that small generator can fuel a couple buildings, power a couple buildings. Tree maintenance, so the tree limbs are addressed. Snow load removal and response plans, where to put the snow, when to take it off a building. Shutters, load path, and roof projects, those are about strong winds and heavy snow loads. Backup systems for equipment like IT equipment. Fire suppression capabilities, making sure that where you don't have fire protection, there's maybe cisterns or dry hydrants. If you're concerned about earthquakes, making sure that things aren't just going to fall. And then public education again. There's a picture on the upper right of a hurricane shutter. The lower right is a dry hydrant. So how about some real pictures? Kind of tired of talking. So here's some pictures of emergency services, which is kind of, like I've said, right? You've got the message. Emergency services is kind of hazard mitigation. Not completely hazard mitigation, but making sure that you can respond and that you have equipment and capabilities, that is hazard mitigation because it does lead to loss reduction. Here's a flood barrier that you've probably seen or heard about. Flood barriers, that's hazard mitigation, reducing the flood loss, presumably. How about a fire break? That's hazard mitigation. Something that you probably aren't going to be spending a lot of time on in the plan. If you were on the West Coast, probably a little bit more time and maybe even applying for funding. But, we're going to address it, but we won't go crazy on it. What's happening right now at Sconset? Is it mitigation? Is it reducing losses in the short term, long term? We can talk about that, but in the short term, it counts as mitigation. Is it appropriate is a whole other question. And that's kind of thing that the hazard mitigation plan, we'll talk at the end about this, but the hazard mitigation plan isn't going to spend a lot of time talking about whether or not something should be the policy in Nantucket. It'll talk about the things that are available should the policy support that. Just kind of get the difference? These are my favorite mitigation pictures from Nantucket. I was trespassing. If it's your house, thank you. This is in Brant Point. I was on the road mostly, kind of. So the air conditioner is elevated, and if you peek inside the garage, yeah, I was trespassing. So the bottom part of it is concrete, cinder block, and then above that is kind of the drywall. That's mitigation, right? So if it floods, and the garage gets flooded up to 2.5, 3 feet, the loss is lower than it would be if it was all drywall. So that home is, and there's also, it's hard to see, but there's a crawl space, so floodwaters can go in and get out. So that's an elevated home. Is it one of yours? No, okay. We're almost at the end. I know you have a lot of questions. So the plan update process, we're in it right now. We're going to be incorporating input from residents, business owners. We like to hear from them, and public officials. There's a survey. We're going to show the link in a moment. Finish characterizing the risks and the losses. We'll develop new mitigation actions if it's appropriate, and then to prepare a draft plan for review by town staff, and also the public can review it. And then the plan is adopted, and then going forward, the town can apply for mitigation funds. So what we'd like to hear from tonight, hopefully I kept this to a half hour. Yes, good. What hazards concern you? Where have you seen losses? Where have you seen risks change? And what ideas do you have for mitigation? Here's the survey. I don't know if you've ever used SurveyMonkey. It's pretty easy. But if you just type in surveymonkey.com, this is pretty easy to remember. Lowercase r, then / the Nantucket hazard. And also the town's website will have this presentation, so you can go to the slide and probably maybe even click on that. Maybe it'll be enabled, I don't know. Or just type it in. Have you taken the survey? Has anybody taken the survey yet? Okay, yeah, good. We've noticed, we check it to see if people are taking the survey.
And it's right on the town website, too.
So with that, I'm going to open up to questions. We have 2 options. You can come up and speak here so that you're recorded, or if you're shy, I can restate your question. So, what do you think? I'll take the shy folks first. Or you can come up. Go ahead.
How about just the implications of the plan lapsing? What were they?
The question was, what were the implications of the plan lapsing? In this case, there were no implications. I've heard of horror stories, towns that have plans, and then they apply for mitigation funds, and the plan lapses and they lose that funding. But the town of Nantucket has not applied for funds in those specific categories. Now, so over the past 10 years, the town has received FEMA funds after declared disasters, and that continues, even if the plan lapses. But the town hasn't tried to obtain mitigation funds. Go ahead.
Now, it's currently working on a coastal resiliency plan. Can you say the difference between the two and how these mesh?
Yep, that's my favorite question of all the questions, because I've worked on both kinds of plans. The coastal resilience plans, you have the freedom to do what you want in a coastal resilience plan. It's an idea book. It's a policy document, and at best it sets policy and has some good ideas going forward to how to be more resilient along our coastline. A FEMA hazard mitigation plan is unfortunately very prescribed. There's a cookbook that FEMA gives you for hazard mitigation plans. You must list your natural hazards, you must describe what the losses have been, what you think the losses will be going forward, and what mitigation actions you think might be taken that fit with our grant programs. So you don't get to do a lot in a hazard mitigation plan. I don't want to undersell it, because you get to apply for mitigation funds by having a hazard mitigation plan. But the coastal resilience plan is where the town can set policy and then see that policy unfold over the next few decades. Does that help? Okay. Go ahead.
On the slide before this one, where you go through the steps that are going to be followed, could you just give us a timeline? For instance, when are we looking to complete the plan and adopt?
Yeah, the question is, what's the timeline associated with the planning process steps? It's a good question. This is our second of 2 public meetings. We're going to be closing the survey here probably in a couple weeks, and we're going to spend this winter writing the plan. I think it'll be probably in front of the town to review a draft at the end of the winter. There's not a whole long time frame here. I think that because it's an update, it's not necessary to have an extended time frame, whereas with the first plan, I think it was probably a year-long process. We can go a little bit quicker this time. I think we were under contract in September, August, maybe, yeah, so we kind of just started. Go ahead.
I have a question regarding a specific area, and I don't know if it's in your plan for consideration.
Okay,
I'm referring to the intersection that's by the high school and the hospital.
okay,
Specifically Prospect Street, which comes down from Mill Hill, and the flooding that has been happening for many, many years on that intersection.
okay,
We have ambulances that have to go through, we have school buses, we're talking about usually heavy rain where the stormwater is not adequate
Okay.
to be removed.
So let me just do a catch-up because I'm restating the question, I think. Prospect at which intersection?
It's Prospect, Atlantic, Sparks, and Surfside Road.
Okay, Prospect Atlantic, Sparks, the 4-way.
Yeah, by the high school.
Drainage-related flooding, it sounds like. So the flood is, the road is covered and it interferes with traffic and response time?
It has at certain times covered from the whole of the bike path to my side. I have tried mitigation to the extent of I have raised the land, put 24 6-foot privet hedges, and I have a
Okay.
catch basin in my backyard, bigger than the ones in the street, because the street cannot contain their own.
Okay.
So I don't know if this has been included, but we have a new hospital, and it should be.
I don't think that it was a big topic in the last plan. I'm going to let Bill comment if you want to. But,
I'm not aware that it was that big of a problem, but I
okay.
mean, it's certainly something.
Well, so this is why we have these meetings. My favorite is we had a meeting in Southbury, Connecticut, I don't know, 15 years ago, and we had missed an entire neighborhood that was constantly getting flooded. The town just wasn't really aware of it.
Let's just say one more thing.
Yes.
In spite of all my mitigation, it has got to the extent that it's high enough so that the trucks going through have splashed water so that my backyard is covered 6 inches up the basement windows, and now it has crossed my property to the house next door,
Okay. So,
which is like 2 houses back from the street.
so this is good information. Let me just, a couple things. I think it's something for us to address in the plan. If you signed in on the sign-in sheet, if you would just put a star next to your name, or have you taken the survey, or can you take the survey, you can also enter information there if you have ideas, but I'm also writing it down.
On the
Sheet
sign-up
here too, if
sheet,
anyone needs it.
my husband made a note,
Okay,
because we're listed at 23 Atlantic. We are on that corner.
great, thank you.
Have you contacted DPW at all over the
I
years?
have contacted everybody and his grandmother. And when you have 6 people in your basement and you're 75 years old trying to set up a pump, and they say, we can't help you because of the liability, that's not friendly.
Okay.
Talk to our new head of sewer?
Yes, and the planning board.
Well,
And
planning board can't.
they have tried their best to empty catch basins, and they're going to tell you that that intersection, God knows when, is going to be redesigned. But while we're waiting for God knows when, we have to make sure.
May I ask how recently you've reached out to the department head of DPW?
Well, they were just doing the street, and in doing the street, they had a 4-inch, they broke a 4-inch storm water pipe, so my basement flooded through the thing, and this was just within 6 months we're talking.
I would recommend talking to David Gray with the head of sewer.
I've talked to the head of the sewer department has been in, the head of the DPW has been in my basement all at the same time. The water company's been in there, and the policeman, and the construction company.
Okay. Well, why,
Know me.
so
Say hi.
there's needs some follow-up. And because I wonder if we should now have people come to the microphone, because I feel like we might be missing comments. So you're exempt. I think we caught most of it. But if folks have specific questions, comfortable coming up? Maybe? Okay. Thank you.
Bill Greeter, guinea pig from Nantucket for the first person up.
Is that one on? Do we know if that one's on? Okay.
Yeah. Just a comment while I was sitting here, because I have horrible penmanship, can't take notes worth a hoot. So I went on the website, the town website, and looked up hazard mitigation plan, and I see that there is in fact a pre-disaster hazard mitigation plan for Nantucket, and then a hazard mitigation plan for Nantucket. So are those the plans that are currently in place that
They are one and the same. Yes.
oh, so now you're confusing me with too much information. So it says pre-disaster plan, and then it says plan. There's two different,
It's just that, well, it could be that the link is called one thing, but then the cover of the document, yeah.
Okay.
It's probably that.
all right, well, when I get back, something I can actually read, I'm going to click on both and see if it takes me to the same place.
And the plan should look like that document right there on the table.
Actually, it's a PowerPoint presentation that it has a lot of stuff similar to this, but it's 44 pages.
That was just the PowerPoint presentation. You want to see that, and that is
Okay.
available on the website.
All right, so that being said, my suggestion would be, especially if you want people to take the survey and stuff, there's several representatives here of area associations, not just in Nantucket, but throughout the island. My suggestion would be that you add a page to this website that has a recap of what you told us, the current status of the plan, what's happening going forward, and also a link to the survey you want us to take. Otherwise, you're subjecting yourselves to the ability of those of us that are going to forward all this information onto many hundreds of homeowners. And we'll start with a disclaimer that if they get the wrong notion of what happened here, it's not going to be our fault. So we want to give you the shot of
Sure.
getting the right information out there.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
And the link is available on the website already.
And I know you were waiting, so come up.
I'm Maureen Phillips. I live at 30 Long Pond in Nantucket. So there's a couple of questions I had. One was, we have, and you somewhat addressed this, and maybe somewhat what Peter Brace had asked earlier, but we have ongoing disasters. The Nantucket, the Erosion, Hither Creek, Ames Street Bridge, that's happening as we speak. It's been happening for it's been happening for a very long time if you want to go back further, and you've got pictures of it. But, that's a disaster that's happening right now. And at the same time, it needs to be addressed now, and it needs to be addressed in the plan. So, and I would also categorize the Sconset Bluff in the same category. That's an ongoing issue. A very controversial one in the town, and so there's things going on today, and then there's plans for additional work to be done on the Sconset Bluff. Mm-hmm. And so how, I guess I want to make sure your plan is aware of, these ongoing things, as well as, I assume you're aware of the new hospital, because something you said, I wasn't sure. The hospital's going through this major expansion, and that's going to change traffic patterns, even because I agree with you. My grandchildren may see that intersection changed, maybe. But, that's a very, very critical area that needs to be addressed. I mean, what's the busiest? You could put one of those traffic counters on it, and you'd be, I don't know what else is as busy as that intersection. So I think that whole ongoing now and in the future, and those need to be intertwined and talked about, and especially where you've got certain neighborhoods, just make sure you get that input, because there isn't one opinion by any means. So, I think that's just in terms of what people feel is important. And then, of course, the Coastal Resiliency Plan, I know that's where we get policy involved, but sometimes things can creep into something that is more almost academic like this, and it can be used to, some people may think it's policy when it's not. And something you were saying several times about, and I remember hearing this from Dave Franzuto earlier this summer, that depending on how you talk about something or use the right words to FEMA or whoever it is, you'll get money if you call it the right thing. And and that's frankly, I was in corporations for a long time, and part of what I think consultants are very helpful for is they know how to talk to the people you want something from. So is that, do you see that as being much of an issue here, where we have to kind of be careful about what we say, or cast it in the right way so that we can get funding?
No, I don't think so. We understand what you mean, definitely, and we want to cast the projects the way they'll get funding the best. There are steps that I sort of didn't cover that are after the hazard mitigation plan. When a town would apply for funding, there's other barriers. I hate to call them barriers, but there's the benefit cost analysis and that sort of thing. So we also try to address some of that in the plan, just to really position the projects as best that we can. So we can make sure that we do that. And FEMA, what's interesting about FEMA is they're not going to have a stake in whether or not we should be entertaining a retreat versus a wall. They just want the losses reduced. There's two ways you can do that. You can reduce the thing that's being damaged, or you can protect it. That's what they want to see. So they, you're right. They're concerned more with the wording and the projects that you might apply for, but they're not concerned with which outcome you might come to.
Oh, no, I understand, because the flood insurance program would indicate that that's the attitude. The other, just one specific thing, something I know, and this came up with the Sconset Bluff, we have so many hard paved asphalt surfaces on this island, on a lot of roads that do not get a great deal of heavy traffic, when I say heavy, I mean both numbers of cars and also, heavy trucks and such, and including our bike paths as well. So, and I did some research for a class I was in about alternative surface types, and that's something and you may have had it in there, but I think that's really an important mitigation measure to consider, because the Baxter Road in Sconset, for instance, that's all paved, and that has contributed, I believe, and I think other people would agree, has contributed to the erosion of the bluffs and the issues there. And I think the town, I would like it if the town would consider this, and in the past, they've been unwilling to, at Conservation Commission meetings I've been to, just having a bike path not be a hard asphalt surface. And so anyways, I think that's something that I would like to see you consider.
Okay, thank you. Lots of good points.
Okay.
Others?
I too live in Nantucket, and I would want to make a comment and then pose a question. The comment is that coming from the West End, and Holly won't be surprised to hear this, there's a great concern about coastal erosion. Just this fall, we've seen 4 houses condemned because the septic systems have been lost through the storms that we experienced. 2 more houses are perilously close to the bluff. they've lost 30 feet of coastline through these storms. So it's a real critical issue for a lot of homeowners. And the big concern for the people who live 50 houses on the other side of Millie's Bridge is the intersection of Ames Avenue and Nantucket Road, which is only 41 feet from the bluff. It used to extend into the Atlantic Ocean probably half a mile or a mile years ago. So we're perilously close to losing that intersection and access to Millie's Bridge. So my question is, would mitigation funds, or would there be FEMA funds available for designing and building an alternative road further landward, and B, for redesigning and reconstructing Millie's Bridge if it ever became compromised as a result of storm surges or coastal erosion?
So the short answer is those are things that I have seen funded in other places. Yes, FEMA has gone on record and funded those kinds of projects. I will be very careful and say that FEMA checks carefully to make sure they're not funding deferred maintenance. So when it comes to the bridge, if they have any inkling that it's a deferred maintenance issue, they'll just pull right back. But in general, stopping erosion and then reinforcing a bridge can be funded by these programs. Again, with a caveat, if they think it's a deferred maintenance issue, they won't fund it.
A follow-up question, if I may. If the town had to expend money to place sand on the bank at the end of Nantucket Road and then replenish that periodically, would that be a mitigation step that FEMA would top up money for?
It used to be, but less so when, they're not funding that type of action that needs constant maintenance as much as they used to. It's my best honest answer. You know what? 10 years ago, they didn't fund generators, and now they do. Things change. So our approach with these plans is, put it in, and you don't know what the future could hold. Go ahead.
Are claims made under the FEMA program on Nantucket public information? So we get a sense for what risks have actually incurred or what damage has been incurred?
You cannot, what's not public is, it's not available at a fine enough scale to know house by house. You can get totals and that sort of thing.
Can you get totals for Nantucket, for example?
Yeah, I think you can get it right on FEMA's website, but again, they're aggregated, they're not, you can never get property specific. We have trouble even getting that for the town on their behalf. Go ahead.
I'm very intrigued by this, what did you call it, pre-disaster funding, mitigation? So 2 questions. Have you ever seen that money go towards building or expanding a salt marsh or a wetland? Because they're pretty good at controlling flooding or helping to control flooding. That's one question. And then the second question is this pre-disaster mitigation money available only to towns and towns' assets, or can individual property owners qualify for it?
Those are good questions. So I have never seen money used for a wetland restoration that was only wetland restoration. I've seen it be used for acquiring a building off the property, then you have to kind of restore the site and make it floodable. So there's a twist. If the site has something on it and losses are being experienced, I've seen that FEMA funds used to purchase that and then restore the site. I just personally haven't seen funds be used for kind of wetland creation here that will benefit these homes here. I think it could be done with some creative grant writing, but I haven't seen it. The second question was who may apply. So only the town can apply, but the town can work with individual property owners and neighborhood associations to come up with projects. The town just has to be the one submitting the application. And actually, the application goes to the state. then the state sends it to FEMA. So there's a couple layers.
I
You
have a
have-
follow-up question.
Go ahead.
Under what circumstances or scenarios does a town have an interest in submitting a funding request for private property?
It's something that I can't answer for the town. I'll give you examples. How about that? Town of Trumbull, Connecticut, there was a resident with a home in the floodway. They were flooded repeatedly, and they created an ally in town government, and the town eventually partnered with them to apply for FEMA funds to have the home bought out. So that's one town's approach. We're going to work with our residents because it's something that we need to do. Other towns haven't taken that approach. I've seen towns say we really can't get involved with specific properties like that. So those are the two extremes, and I don't know what the policy would be here. I would think it's something that we could explore in the coastal resilience plan because it's kind of a policy question. I don't think the town has applied for any individual homes so far.
This plan that we're talking about today, that's going to focus, Nantucket's a good example, I think, of where there's a line. What you brought up about the road realignment, the bridge reinforcement, whatever, it's a fairly new bridge, so it's not an issue of deferred maintenance. It's an issue of the shoreline has eroded. That is very potentially, the DPW director and I have had extensive conversations, something that will probably or should be in this plan. But anything in this plan isn't going to get built next year. This is years down the road before hazard mitigation really takes effect, because it involves a lot of coordination. It involves how much money is available from the federal government for disaster mitigation, and which tends to not be as much as what people think here in Massachusetts. It's not like Florida that gets a lot more money, and other damaged areas. But we look at other things like the coastal mitigation, or the coastal zone management has programs that might be what could be used to fund that dredging and beach renourishment, things like that. What the town, I think, is doing finally is we're looking at all the different options out there and trying to come up with a coherent plan. But what has always been missing, this plan is kind of just a sideshow in my opinion. It's got to be done so that we're eligible potentially for grants. My prediction is we'll never get a grant as a result of this, just because it's never worked out before. We've always had to build it before we could get through the process of dealing with the grant. But what is a reality is in our the mitigation, or what's the other one? Coastal resiliency plan, is we're lacking the policy tools to make people do what needs to be done to get these things moving forward. And that's what we're hoping to really make an impact from the town perspective, is that coastal resiliency plan. Because that will then give us the tools and the rules to put in place, the guidance on the rules to put in place, to make sure that we're all on the same page, or at least we know what the map looks like that we're working with, that kind of thing. This plan, I think when we're said and done, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, we'll identify maybe a half dozen projects that are potentially able to be done in the next 5 years. And then we'll move on from there to another set. And they're going to likely impact a great number of people rather than an individual home or this stuff or that is most likely going to be the case.
Thank you.
If FEMA's interested in mitigating the financial impacts, which is I think what you were saying early on, it always seemed to me a policy they might be interested in is having people who develop in the way of hazards to sign liability waivers. Has that ever been explored with FEMA or with other communities, so that claims against the government or the taxpayer are mitigated?
Yeah, we're not there yet. Where we are is the new actuarial flood mitigation, flood insurance policies, which are very high for some people. And we're waiting to see, frankly, if someone who used to pay $1,000 a year and now is paying $60,000 a year is going to think twice. But that's kind of where we are in this whole, what you're asking about. We're not at that step yet. Not here, anyway.
Earlier on in your slide, you were talking about that FEMA often can look favorably on something if it's a historical or cultural site. How does one go about showing that something is
Yeah.
fits
Typically, you work with the state agency that's charged with helping to list. I mean, a property can be listed locally on the state register or the federal register. Those are 3 different lists. And you would work with the state agency that helps you decide if it's historic. Usually most states can help pay for historic resource surveys. I don't know if that's happening right now. I haven't heard. I have to check. So,
A lot of properties already on the mass.
right, you do. So there's a process to get onto one of the lists, and then after that, it kind of changes what can and can't be done.
That's a new element since the adoption of the original plan. FEMA is actually encouraging that, which is great for a coastal historic place like us. So we're definitely going to be having that in the plan.
I think it's you, yeah.
Just a quick question for Holly. Isn't the entire island have a historic designation of some kind?
Yes, we are a historic district. Yes, the entire island is, yes. Yep.
I
But
think that would be a big factor.
I'm not too sure when those regulations came out.
That's
But
Entire island isn't a historic district, it's a
National Historic Landmark, yeah.
Okay.
2 historic districts,
Yes.
Wisconsin.
In town. And we do have surveys available, and we also have the Massachusetts link. You can actually get that right on their website.
Thank you.
Comment and a question. On purchasing properties on this island, or building on this island, how forth by are we, in order of making it easy for folks, either developers or individual buyers, in the sensitive spots that perhaps we all know, or is that just common knowledge and it's up to the buyer to where and figure it out?
Yeah.
I don't think I follow your question, I apologize.
Yeah. The awareness, like Cisco, how many streets are gone? Is it easy for purchasers to be aware of the risk they take on buying property? If they call the town office, could they find that out? Or is that something, it's a private thing between the realtor and whoever buys it, and it's private business?
Well, I think that's one way that hazard mitigation plans actually could help. I mean, they're public documents. They're full of flood maps. I mean, you all know how to find the flood maps anyway, but there's also the map of areas that erode. So let's say someone's purchasing a home and the realtor is dishonest. You can still find other ways to get information about the risks. I think that's one of the benefits of these plans is then they're out there in the world on town websites and you can look up what the risk could be. But the larger question you're asking, I don't know the answer to that.
I can say we get calls all the time from people who go over the flood map information with them. And there is a process when you're, it depends if somebody comes in, has cash, they're gonna buy a house, they have a lot less information brought to them, or they're directed to. But if somebody comes in, they get a mortgage, they get insurance on a property, the insurance companies and the mortgage companies steer them where they need to go for this information, because they're gonna, quite frankly, they're not gonna mortgage it if it's got a land expectancy of 10 years and they want a 30-year mortgage. So there is some help there. It's just the uber rich that could avoid that, I guess. Yeah.
Just about that point, I was looking at property at Sheep's Pond Road, the property is no longer there now, But even then, when the plot plan, they had to show what, going back, I think, 25 years where the shoreline had been. So I think no matter what you pay or how you pay, I think the plot line, the plot plan has to show that.
Thank you.
And, so I think that is, I'm sorry, I don't know what the requirement is, but I think it was, it may well be a state requirement or something that there's in erosion, you have to show a shoreline going back 25 years.
Okay.
That's just on coastal property.
Right, oh yeah, just on coastal property, right. Yeah, if you're subject to internal flooding.
That's a different animal.
Does the plan take into account our fluctuating population? As you know, we go from 15 so to 60,000, so something that would be part of the plan.
Somewhat. I mean, to the extent that it affects the things that we've talked about, it takes that into account. Yes. Mhm. Is there a hand in the front? Or, oh, go ahead.
The town has paid for quite an extensive study, and I can't remember the exact name, but it's got pathways in it, which talks about where the water goes, and it's determinate. It's not what if. And I would suggest that this process include that research and that's already been done, and that there's a link, or that it is included. It'll help build a case, at the very least, and the town
Do you
spent a
mean
fair amount of money to do it.
The watershed management plans? Okay.
And which one she's talking about.
And the Nantucket pathways, and it has that in it.
Well, it deals with a lot of that pond flooding. It goes through like Orange Street and My Comet Pond and the different things, and it talks about the flowages, the watersheds.
All I know is the water comes from directions that you never expected it to.
That probably wouldn't have a lot of impact on the plan as such, but I know exactly where you're talking about. That information is good when we're looking at a solution to a problem.
But we'll be looking at it too. We have, it's our job to look at everything that's been done in the past since the previous plan, and so we'll do that.
Okay. As far as sensitivities, is it helpful to have somewhere embedded in this plan the fact that the sole aquifers of the island and the repercussions of whatever could happen to that system that's unique in here, unlike many places in the
Yeah. I would say, so a few years ago, I would have said no, but a couple years ago, FEMA broadened its list of what can be kind of in these plans, and they brought in the groundwater issues. So I think we could look at including that as well. Other questions?
I just wanted to thank you guys for giving me time information to us tonight. I'm not sure if this is a question for you or for someone else, but I want to know how to be more involved.
So I don't know. I guess we're not officially working on that yet, but it's bubbling out there somewhere. So do you have an answer to that, I guess?
Well, I know there's been the process for the coastal resiliency will be very, very much the same as this. There'll be opportunities for public input. There'll be significant public discussion because it involves public policy, much more so than in my opinion. This is just more specific project identification and guidance, but the coastal resiliency will involve the Board of Selectmen and different public boards on the island having to actually make policy decisions. If I could just take a second on the coastal resiliency, what is a glaring example of what's broken with the way the town does things like that is look at the Easy Street Basin. The town last year with a CZM grant built that new wall there, raised it up to accommodate the future flooding estimates and everything. And then literally at the same time we're building that, the North Wharf folks are rebuilding their seawall. And theirs is 1.5 feet lower than ours. Because nobody told them that they should probably bring that up to higher standard. And none of the permitting bodies, nobody really did that. And that's where we're hopeful that the mitigation plan, or the coastal zone resiliency plan, there's too many names around it, will help alleviate that problem and provide the different boards and commissions, permitting agencies, and everybody with consistent advice on what to do with these projects. Because together, they both, between the steamship, the town, and those residents on North Wharf, they could have made a heck of a difference in future flood risk along there. But as it turns out, our wall probably makes their problem more. So, that's just an example, in my opinion, of why we need that other plan.
That's a great example. You should have butted in earlier when I was just up here. Okay. Questions? I think we're doing okay on time. Take a look. Yeah, it's 7 o'clock. Other comments? You could always get in touch with us afterwards, take the survey. If you didn't sign in and would like to sign in, I'll pass the list back around.
If I can say one more thing, I don't know if I answered your question entirely about how you get involved, but I know Deanne Atherton, for instance, has been very active in making sure that citizens' voice is heard. And that project is still focused in Libby Gibson's office. She hasn't delegated it out to a particular department yet. It's not going to be us. I'm pretty sure it'll probably be the DPW. But at that point, I would recommend that you get in touch with Deanne, get on her list, and that way you get the regular updates and you get the information back from the town of where we're at with it, and you can give input on that. So it's been very helpful in driving the response. Sorry, Deanne.
That's no good. I can comment on that because the town manager did share with us the scope of services for the coastal resiliency plan. And the coastal conservancy reviewed it and is somewhat concerned about the extent of community input. And in fact, I spoke with Charlie Stott today. We'd like to go to the town manager and offer our assistance to work with Malone and McBroom to facilitate the community involvement because it's time consuming and it's expensive. And if we can do that as volunteers, that will make the plan stronger because we do need input from every neighborhood since all the coastal neighborhoods have different issues. So it's something that is a work in progress.
Thank you.
By talking to this, it goes to the record, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I don't know if you guys have looked at this, and I know it's a ways out, but in relation to using the example of Chris Emery's house there opposite Millie's Bridge, and how we saw that change over the last month or so, looking out, I don't know how many years, but CO2 is our natural barrier, protects our harbor and the haulover. I'll bet CO2 isn't any higher than 7 feet over sea level, and there have been instances during storms, nor'easters, when that's been overwashed. Also, Cascade Pond, there's a dune that almost no longer exists between that and the ocean. I'd say in all of our lifetimes, that part of the island will become an island. Just to consider those things, those parts of the island, because without those natural barriers, we've got the open ocean breaking on the inner harbor shores, and that's all kinds of other places where you'll have to have mitigation and resiliency.
Thank you, good point.
I just wanted to point everybody out to the town's website. This, if you just go to the main page and do what I did, just search hazard mitigation plan. This takes you to the hazard mitigation plan page. This is where you can click to take the survey. So it's right here. That's all you gotta do is click it. We will put this presentation up on here. We'll get rid of the one that was on here that was confusing. But all you have to do is click here and it'll take you to it.
Oh, now you're going to take the survey. You can't stop. It's going to show up as like an empty field the whole way through when I look at it later. Okay. And the survey has, frankly, if you like none of the questions, at the end there's write-in boxes. You can just type in your answer.
How many responses have you gotten already?
Oh gosh, I think Noah told us already and I forgot. My helper had counted and
In October, there was about 26.
yeah, so we're definitely above 30. I mean, sometimes we get 2 or 3, so 30 is not bad. It might not sound good, but at the other extreme, when you get, because I've been on the receiving end of 200 survey takers, that's also not always helpful because,
All of them say the same thing.
right, you want a good sample size of diversity and not too much snark, and then you can kind of get some good answers. But so far it's been good. We've looked at it and it's good answers. Take it if you'd like to.
Well, I think Bill's comment about getting to the Civic Association knows the heads of all the homeowners associations. They all have push email, and they can send it out to their members.
Okay.
All they gotta do is direct them to that page and they can click it.
They just have to know about it. You have to ask them and say, hey, homeowner association presidents, here's an idea.
Well, and this will be good because you can enter your email address in the survey, and then we'll have those people all their direct information for the coastal resilience plan too, which could be helpful. Well, thank you, everybody, and you could talk to me afterwards if you're want to stick around.
Thank you for coming, we appreciate it.